I wanted to do a podcast today with the guest that I've invited, Jim Henderson. I've met Jim probably good 10, 12 years ago for my very first apartment complex that I've purchased. It was an estate sale that had crackies, drug dealers, hoes, like you name it, we had it. And then I've hired Jim. Jim works with Landlord Solutions out of Tacoma, Washington. You specialize in landlord tenant rescues, I suppose is what I would call it at the end of the day. And you help out oftentimes landlords with their evictions or whatever questions that we might have that comes, when it comes to owning a building. And I just kind of wanted to invite you today to bring you here to kind of pick your brain, talk to you about what's going on, what's happening. Oh, you're also running for Washington State Representative, 26th District,
That's
right?
right, yes.
Congratulations.
Thank
That's
you.
a big deal.
Yes.
So I'm kind of excited to have you here today and kind of go over what the new proposed laws are that are in place, how that's going to affect landlords and investors in general, and what that's going to do to our area.
Okay. So much for us to talk about.
To unpack, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Just curious, so was the property that we met over, was it the one was it in Enumclaw?
Yep,
Yeah.
Dean Street's building.
I
Out of 13 units, we only kept 3 original tenants. Everybody else got evicted. They were crackies, remember?
Yeah. So yes, I own Landlord Solutions. I've had this company for 23 years. We specialize in working with housing providers and just really solving the landlord-tenant problems. Ultimately, yes, what we do is we facilitate the unlawful detainer or eviction process for our clients. But we're also good at trying to work out alternatives, and we're good at kind of just coaching housing providers through difficult situations. Oftentimes, when there's a lease violation other than non-payment of rent, behavioral issues, and we are seeing a lot of behavioral issues on our properties, and we've seen this, and we'll kind of come back to this, but this has been a trending upward as we've also seen the enforcement of laws change as well. So there's an impact on when the legislature, based on a Washington State Supreme Court case, changed the threshold for possession of drugs. I think that has also been a factor in how much criminal activity we've seen on our properties, as well as when the pursuit laws changed, then we saw new types of criminal activity happen in our property. So we'll cover that a little bit more. But the last thing, Landlord Solutions also does background checks, and we're going to talk a little bit about where I kind of foresee this going in our state as well.
What do you think it's going in our state?
I predict that there will be a push to remove the landlord's ability to do a background check on a prospective resident. We already see, for example, in Seattle, where you're not allowed to use criminal background checks as part of the screening process. It has come up at different times over the last 5 years around the use of credit scores. And
Has it passed?
The one in Seattle did pass, and it's under law called First in Time, was also passed at the same time. So we've 2 kind of background screening laws there. But yes, in Seattle, you're not allowed to screen your applicant for criminal records.
So what happens? I'm a landlord.
Mm-hmm.
I own 10 units, let's say, in city of Seattle. And I have a bunch of kids living in my building. And now, because I cannot background check a criminal activity on a potential tenant, a criminal moves in, am I not responsible for the kids that live in my building? Or is this just like, oh, we don't care, criminal or not, he can live next to children? Like, as a parent, that just frightens me.
Yeah, I think it's all the above. I mean, and I don't know what what's going to happen if somebody, if that person moves in and they have a criminal record and crimes against a person has been the conviction, that the charge that they're convicted of, then I would imagine that the landlord will be sued. Will they be found responsible, or will they or liable for that? I don't know. I mean, but there will be a lawsuit by the person whom was harmed living in the building next to this other person.
And it's landlord's fault because they let the criminal in the building, I'm sure, is what the argument is going to be.
I think it's the theory that everybody gets sued in a situation like that. It's the landlord. It's also, you know, if there's a property manager involved, there's also the insurance company would then
But it's
defend
not the city
that.
who passed the law.
Well, but then again, I mean, yes, but then is there a countersuit to the city? Because, I mean, you're only following the law. Right.
It should be interesting.
Yes.
I like this.
Yeah.
This is going to uncover that.
So, but, you know, Seattle passed this law several years ago. We don't have a case where, as a result of the law, we somebody who has been harmed by a resident moving in yet. We don't know of one. I mean, I don't know that it hasn't happened, but.
So here's the thing. I'm going to jump right into it.
Yeah.
I know it's supposed to be down the road. I have my
Yeah.
list of questions to ask you. So one of the proposed laws is to ban credit check as well.
We don't have a proposed law. I think
Oh.
that what we have is just that this conversation keeps coming back around, and it comes up more regularly. It is coming up about the use of credit score in our screening process and in our decision-making process.
So I'll tell you how currently investors are trying to avoid having crazies and crackies in their building by requesting that no criminal activity must make 3 times rent and credit score of 700. Chances are you're going to avoid crazies in your building and protect the neighbors in your building, right?
Right.
So by removing,
All of
hopefully
that.
they're not going to remove it, but
But-
by wanting to remove that, now they're again handcuffing landlords from putting good qualified tenants in these buildings.
Yes, and I would say that also it completely disregards the other residents who live in the building and their right to quiet enjoyment and their right to use their property without having a disruptive or dangerous neighbor.
I was going to ask you, what are some of the laws that are going to be coming into place that frighten you and or scare you? And I feel like, is this it, or there's more to it?
I think, there are definitely others and others that are already out there that we defeated this legislative session that will come back next session. But I think if we're looking down the road, I think that this is one that we shouldn't be surprised when we see it.
So as a landlord, as an investor, what can we do?
Gosh,
How do we make city hear us that it is not a good idea to allow things like that?
I think what we really need is we need our residents to speak up. We need residents to say that they want some standard of assurance that when they're moving into their home, that everybody who's living around them is being moved in under a same standard or one standard.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we need them to speak up, and I think that we also need to look at housing that is maybe more appropriate for somebody that maybe has a criminal conviction of crimes against a person. They need housing, but maybe they need housing that isn't or that is somewhere else. I don't know what that looks like. So I think it's tricky, or it's a difficult balance to find. And I think we need, just continuing to look at the data and look at any research that's out there around the issue. But I think that we're on it is that as the risk for being a housing provider increases, when you have less ability to offset that risk, that is what's pushing housing providers out of the business. That's why they are leaving Washington State, because they just feel that there's this huge risk, whether it's in not being able to screen or in a cap on the deposit. We'll talk more about these, but whenever the risk goes up and the landlord's not able to offset that risk, I think that they just say that that's a bad business model, and particularly when we look at every other industry has a model to offset risk. The legislature and cities and even counties, they pass ordinances and laws that take away that ability for the landlord to offset the risk.
Like with me personally, I saw a lot of these rules, laws, regulations come into place at the end of like 2018, beginning of 19,
Yeah.
is when I kind of started seeing things started shaking up.
Yeah.
I started pulling my assets out of Washington State because I just saw it from a mile away. I knew this wasn't going to end well. I pulled everything out of Washington. I moved my properties to, I hate to say it, red states, because they're a lot more landlord friendly. They encourage businesses. They want you to come and do more business with them. A lot of investors flooded those states. Rents did skyrocket, which I know city of Seattle and like Washington in general has good intentions. They want to control rent. They want to be able to have these tenants have affordable rent, but I think at the end of the day they're just hurting everything by throwing money at these problems. Like I pulled my money out, I put my properties in other states that are landlord friendly, and at the end of the day, yes, the rents went up, but those states encouraged investors to invest there, encourage builders to build there. There was more supply provided, and all of a sudden, a year and a half, 2 years later, we saw rents come down in prices, right?
Right.
So, to me, I would think that's a simple solution. Encourage builders to build, encourage investors to invest, and like supply and demand will take over and it will naturally adjust itself. It seems like they're just fighting the economics of this whole thing, the system. They're fighting the system, it seems like.
Yeah, they are. I mean, they think that the solution is to socialize housing instead of incentivize the building of more housing, and it's not working. I mean, and 2018 was the first year that one of the biggest changes to the landlord-tenant law statewide had been made, and since then they continue to pass policies that that make being a landlord more difficult, more complicated, more uncertain. And I think that in addition, on the building side of it, that's a local issue. So you don't have local cities or counties that have streamlined their permit process in order to encourage more building or to get more units in the market faster. And and we're losing supply on the single family side so quickly because when those units are sold, they typically don't stay in the rental pool. They are purchased by a first-time home buyer. So we're growing that part of the state, and we're getting more first-time home buyers because that inventory that was rental is being released into the for sale market. But at the same time, we're losing housing choices. And while you can build a 100-unit apartment building to replace those 100 single-family homes, but those apartment buildings are typically studio or maybe one-bedroom units, so they don't fit the same need for the same person who's looking for that single-family home.
Couple with the kid, for example.
Yeah, anybody who needs more than a bedroom or more than a studio, or who wants just a different housing type, that studio unit isn't going to meet that need.
So I know if we can talk about this a little bit, rent control keeps coming up every year. It seems like I know you had me come out last year in Olympia. There were a lot of landlords that spoke against it. And do you want to unpack a little bit about rent control? Is it still on the chopping board?
It is. So I'd say since 2019, we've had a rent control bill in some version. Year before last, so 2022, during that session, we had 6 rent control bills at one time that were being attempted to be passed. So yeah, I mean, rent control. I mean, as legislation works, once a bill is introduced, either the bill and or the concept of the bill doesn't go away.
So they're just going to keep bringing it up until it hits us.
Yep. And they'll keep bringing up different versions of it. They'll just keep retooling the concept of it, and just the rent control model. They'll just keep retooling it until they think that they're going to find something in which is going to be passable.
Let's break this down for those listeners that are not landlords. Perhaps they're tenants and they think that landlords are evil and rent control does need to be put in place. Tell us why that's a bad idea. So
rent control is a failed policy, and if we look at every market where rent control exists, it hasn't solved the affordability problem. And oftentimes legislators are always they want to attach affordability to rent control. Those two things are not the same. So just in principle, what rent control does is it caps the amount the landlord can raise the rent every year. And in Washington State, the bill started out at 5%. There was an amendment put on the bill that when it passed out of the House this year, and it was at 7%. Okay, so landlords cannot meet their operating cost at 7%. Property tax increases, local levies, local bonds. If you if you want to pass those levies and bonds with your schools or libraries or parks department or your police department, I mean, all of those are not controlled by the state because they're local tax issues. That will eat at that 7%. And at some point, the landlord's not able to cover the cost, which one of two things has to happen at that point. And what often happens is, so the two things that happen is the landlord either sells it or they stop making any improvements or repairs or upgrades to the property. The latter is what typically happens. So if we look at New York and, landlords just don't fix anything. And then that falls on to the resident. And in our state, landlords have a high responsibility and a duty to maintain the property. So if we want to continue to maintain quality housing, you want to continue as a resident to rent quality housing and have a certain standard that you can depend on. Rent control is going to erode that standard. I think also what happens with rent control historically is you get into a unit, that unit is rent controlled, your family size changes, your needs change, but because your unit is at this rent controlled level, you don't move. So what happens is you start to fall behind on what the actual market rent is for your property. So for example, if you were in a rent controlled unit and you moved, you would be entering in at the market rate at that time for that new unit. Well, so because of that, historically, residents don't take new opportunities. They don't move for better jobs. They also, the unit you're in doesn't get released to the next person. Right.
That needs an affordable place.
Or that they need the size unit that you have. So if one time you needed a 2-bedroom, but now you need a 1-bedroom, well, somebody else who needs a 2-bedroom can't find one because there's no movement in the marketplace. People are not naturally moving and changing their housing type.
And why would they move? It's so damn cheap.
Well, and I think this is the other thing. When is rent control going to how many years under a rent control policy will it take before you feel as a resident that rent is affordable? Because I don't see it happening, maybe in 5 years, it'll finally where the rent is now at a place where now you're seeing that, my rent is at $1,500, but the same unit in the marketplace for somebody who's just moving in is now more than that. It's not going to happen right away.
That's interesting. A lot of my clients are actually that have owned their building since, 10 plus years. They've kept their units affordable because they owe so little and the interest rate is so low on that mortgage. It's your typical case, but now with these draconian landlord-tenant laws, they're not able to stay on top of all these laws, rules, regulations. They practically need to have an attorney on the speed dial at the moment. They're giving up and they're moving their assets. They're going to other states because they can't upkeep. And in a way, it seems like the state is hurting by they're meeting their destiny on a road they're taking to avoid it, right? They're wanting to avoid this problem, but yet they're causing this problem because this landlord that had this building for so long at an affordable price is forced to sell it now.
Or they're forced to raise the rent every year to the maximum that they can when they didn't need to, or they would not have previously raised it to that maximum because there was an interest for their business model that kept it at the rate and what they would have raised it at otherwise. But since now they don't know what the market's going to go to. You don't know what your property tax is going to be because you don't have the ability to adjust it. Maybe 1 year at 3%, but maybe 1 year you're at 8%. You would not have the flexibility to do that. So you would be back in that spot of, and as a resident, you would be guaranteed a rent increase at the maximum every year because the landlord would need to be thinking about the next 10 years. And as we go up and down in the real estate cycle, you have to plan out. And historically, if you were to look at what your overall operating costs are, you could look at that, but then you would have to then apply a number that would get you to that same place in 10 years, which means you're just going to have to hit the maximum rent increase every single year, even if it wasn't necessary.
Do you want to talk about B&O tax?
Yeah, this is just another.
Tell me what that is. Actually,
sure.
I didn't read up on anything on purpose.
Okay. Well, and back to this. We'll talk about this because we can go in so many directions. But I'll say. Well, let me say this. I no longer believe in unintended consequences. I think that as a lobbyist for the industry, as a real estate investor myself, those who advocate on behalf of housing providers, I think that we're actually advocating more. We're doing more for residents than the people who say that they advocate for the resident. But I'll say that we tell lawmakers these are the consequences. This is what's going to happen if this policy was passed. This is how the market's going to likely respond to it and react to it. And and I don't think that they either believe us or they think that I think they just don't believe us is primarily, but also it's the consequence doesn't outweigh what they think the benefit is. And I think you're right. I think that as we've even seen with like the Seattle City Council, it got so extreme that finally this last year in 2022, it kind of self-corrected itself, and those who were elected into the city council were more, I would say, less extreme, so more middle moderate, which you need that, and we'll go a little bit about that when we talk about kind of some other like statewide races.
I'm unaware of the self-correction. What happened?
Well, we saw a change, and we saw some council members leave, and then we saw some who didn't win their race, who were more on the extreme end of issues. Gotcha. City councils are nonpartisan, but when we look at the progressive policies that those lawmakers who aren't there were attempting to pass, they were so extreme that. I think that now what you have and I think what is the most effective kind of balance, and I would say balance is the most effective way to govern. You're always going to have people on the end, but that can't be the majority. You're going to have people who are in the middle working together to come up with good solutions.
Win-win for everyone.
Yeah, and spending money on a problem isn't the win, because
what do you think the solutions are? I'd love to hear your opinion.
Well, let's talk about B&O tax, because this is not a solution. So business and occupation tax. Businesses pay this already. So if you own a business, you got any sort of business in Washington State, you are paying this. And in some cities, you are paying this to the city as well. So you pay a state B&O as well as you pay a city B&O in cities. So rental income is not subject to B&O tax.
Okay.
So this year, there was a bill that proposed that rental income would be taxed. It would be subject to the B&O tax.
Interesting.
And we said, well, so here's what doesn't make sense. But yet, the same lawmakers will also say that rent is not affordable. But yet they come up with bills that then just add to the cost of rent
to make it not affordable.
Yeah,
again.
and it's you look. I mean, and I don't think it's any secret that the business model of being a housing provider is that those expenses are directly paid by rent. Now, if you're fortunate, because not all housing providers can cover their operating cost, which is rent, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, sometimes employees, cannot cover those costs with the rent. So they fall short every month, just because, housing is expensive, which is a reason why we're not going to see new investors or current investors investing in single family property and probably even some multifamily properties, because the interest rates are so high, which would drive the cost, and the rent just isn't going to cover that cost.
Insurance. I don't know if you've seen it. It is a nightmare.
If you can get it, right? Or keep it.
If you can get it. If you can keep it, if you can get it. I'm constantly getting bounced around like, oh, just kidding. You don't have insurance anymore. One of my clients here in Seattle, they were paying $2,300 on a 6-unit apartment. Renewal, actually this week, $8,000. Same exact building. And they are trying so hard to not raise people's rents. What does that do?
Right.
You have to offset it somehow.
Right. And this is the unpredictability that, a rent control bill that caps what you can increase rent doesn't take into account. So it's interesting. And so when you can't pay your bills, what happens? I mean, landlords don't want to go broke. They don't want to go bankrupt. They don't want to get foreclosed on. So they sell it. And when they sell it, that resident loses their place to live, potentially, if it's a single family home, because the person who often buys it is not buying it as investment. They're buying it as to live in it because it's so expensive. And then with interest rates where they're at, it just makes the mortgage so expensive that rent would not cover even half of that expense.
It doesn't pencil out. That's nuts.
But that wasn't I would just say that wasn't the only bill that the legislature came up with that would have increased rent. I mean, we had another bill that would have required landlords to report tenants' on-time payments to credit bureaus. Mandatory credit reporting is what it was referred to.
Now you have to hire another person to do that full time.
You got to set up an account. You got to figure out a way. I mean, it was we learned how complicated it was. But it's another one of those, okay, we see the good intent behind it. Residents, it's your largest bill. I mean, as when you have a mortgage, you get credit for, on your credit report for that. So we don't not support the concept, but it just doesn't need to be done through the landlord. Also, the bill would have only allowed landlords to report positive credit. What the legislature learned was that if you don't allow the late payments or the non-payments to be reported as well, then anybody who is evaluating that trade line on the credit report, they're not going to give it consideration because it's skewed. So it really doesn't help the resident when you only for what they were attempting, what the bill was attempting to do was to give them some credit rating benefit through paying rent, but in order to do that, you had to report positive and negative. So sometimes it's just a process of learning kind of how the industry works. Mm-hmm. I will give credit to the two sponsors, the House sponsor and the Senate sponsor on those bills. I mean, they worked with us and in bringing in their experts and us and learning about those nuances and differences.
At least they're curious.
Yeah. And it's also something that the resident could do themselves. They didn't need the landlord to do this. There's already products and services available that the resident can engage on, and by doing that, they control the cost. Because what we found out in the marketplace, depending on the size of your portfolio, the cost varied anywhere from a couple dollars a month per unit to quite a bit more. And the lawmakers also didn't want landlords to increase rent to cover that cost.
And that's what they would do.
That's what we told them that they would do, because and then when you have, let's say you had 5,000 units, you're a large company and you have 5,000 units, well you're going to have to hire someone. So that factors in not only to the cost of the of reporting it, because there's a cost just there, but also getting the information to the third party to be able to report it.
Hopefully they won't bring it back again.
No.
City of Tacoma. You want to talk about what they have going on there?
Sure. Yeah.
Where do we start?
Gosh. I used to say when this topic came up, I was like, oh, it's too soon. Like, I'm not ready to talk about this. But
what has passed?
So what passed. So on what went into effect on last November, the voters in the city of Tacoma approved what we refer to as Measure 1. It was a initiative that the group that there was a group called Tacoma for All. They went out and they collected signatures. They had to collect about 4,700 signatures, valid signatures, and in order to get it, to get the initiative on the ballot, they were successful in doing that. So and then it was on the ballot and the voters voted. That initiative passed by about 338 votes. So it barely passed. It went into effect December 8th of 23, and kind of give the highlights of what it does. It caps late fees at $10 per month. If you raise rent 5% or more, you have to pay the resident relocation cost. The relocation is depending on the amount of the increase. It's scaffold, so it's anywhere from 2 times, 2.5 times, or 3 times the rent, depending on what the percentage, 5% or above is. And it's at the new rate. So if if rent is, the new rent's $2,000 a month, that's what you're paying the 2, 2.5, or 3 times on. Note that if you pay the resident relocation, so the rent increase is 6 months. So that was a change. So it went from 120 days. It went from 60 days to 120 days to 6 months within a couple of months. And there's a story there, but yet you also, if you were to raise it 5% or more, the resident could request the relocation within 30 days of receiving notice, but yet they're not moving for up to 6 months. And then if they didn't move, and if they didn't pay you back the relocation you paid them, there was the only recourse the landlord has is small claims court. Also, there are 2 new eviction bans. There's what's called the winter months eviction ban that runs from November 1st to April 1st. And then there's the school year eviction ban that if in the household there is a school-age child, and I think it starts at age 2 to 18, but in school. The 2-year-old doesn't have to be in school, but it's age 2 to 18. Then you can't do an eviction until after the school year ends, and the school year is determined by the local school districts, or the Tacoma school districts. This year it's June 22nd.
Yeah,
I want to say it's the last day of
so
school.
then you have July and August to evict, but it takes a couple months just to get everything through the system.
Yeah.
So now they're back to living free for another year.
You can file the eviction. You can go through all the court proceedings. What the courts will then determine if the resident is eligible for the either ban. If it's the winter ban, so the court case just starts with it's winter ban, we'll see you back on April 2nd. And the courts have said that we can tell them to pay rent, but we can't enforce that they have to pay rent during that time.
So then what happens? What have you seen? Because it's been in place for a few months.
Yeah.
Are they paying rent?
No. They weren't paying rent before, and they continue to not pay rent.
So now they're staying rent-free for a year.
Well, so
9 months or whatever that is.
Yeah, right now it's taking about anywhere from 4 to 6 months to get through just the serving the resident. Remember, most cases are based on a notice to pay or vacate. So and that under CARES Act is 30 days notice to pay or vacate oftentimes. So you have 30 days there. Then you have anywhere from 3 to 5 months more of getting through the court proceeding process of your case, to the point that then you get a final determination. But if that court case is you're in the winter months, then
you're back to square one.
Well, you're just waiting until April 2nd to come in and say, okay, the ban is over. But the next question the court has is, well, are there any school aids? That's right. And
we have kids now. Wait till June 22nd. Right. So now we're year 2 for free.
Well, so then you go in and after June 22nd, and then the court says, okay, there's no kids, or whenever, and then you get the writ. Well, the writ takes about 6 weeks to 8 weeks to process.
So now we're back to school year.
So now we're close back to the winter months. right? Because then you're back
So
into.
is that not considered theft?
I think it is.
That is considered theft, but yet they're protected.
Yeah.
That just makes no sense. That just smells like class action lawsuit.
And I think that we will see one.
I would love to see one. I'd pay to see one.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we're
I'm
getting
probably
close.
going to get canceled for all this. But at the end of the day, it's business. Like, how is it okay to stay in somebody's house for free for years on end
And if you believe
and be protected?
right, and I think that we need to solve the problem as to why the resident's unable to pay rent, because when they moved into the unit,
Exactly.
they had an income that we approved them to be able to pay the rent. Otherwise, we wouldn't have moved them in.
But then here's another thing. They're trying to take away that as well. You can no longer approve them based on their background check or based on what they're making or based on their criminal activity. So now we're blindly letting any crazies into the building that can stay there for years on end for free.
And even in Tacoma, the city council passed an ordinance in 2023 that changed our income to rent and model. So and what they did is they said, okay, if your rent is below the HUD fair market rent that's published by HUD every year, if it's below, you can ask for 3 times the rent. But if your rent is at or above the fair market rent for HUD standards, you can only ask for 2 times the income for the rent.
And how are they supposed to survive on 2 times the income?
There you go. And so we talk a lot about how residents are spending more of their income on rent, but let's go back to 2007 when we saw a lot of foreclosures. We saw our rental market was very stable because of that standard that we had residents coming in, and we had a standard, typically the industry standards between 2.5 and 3 times income to rent. But when you're using a number published by HUD to determine what that 2 times or 3 is, I think that we're setting residents up to fail because we're allowing them to overbuy. And just like when we go buy a house or we go buy a car, I mean, there is a limit to how much car payment, that the lender is going to approve us based on
your debt to income ratio.
Right.
Yes.
And there's just a business reason behind it, and housing
because
providers
you're simply
are no
not
different.
going to be able to afford. It's for
That's right.
their own good.
That's right.
It's for their own good.
That's right.
Well, here's another thing. Like, just evict me. Like, I don't think people realize eviction never leaves your credit ever. Is it true?
Well, so here's the thing: credit bureaus don't report the eviction on the credit report, and then we have
I've seen them.
then we have back in the day. It's probably been now 10 years. What you might see is a judgment, but typically you don't, because our judgments don't have, the only identifier in our judgment is the resident's name and their address. We don't have another identifier. Like, we don't have social security numbers. We don't have date of births. So credit bureaus stopped reporting those judgments years ago. I mean, many years.
So here's a question. I know all these rules, regulations end up hurting your little mom and pop shops that keep rents affordable.
Right.
What are savvy investors doing? Because there are clearly ways around it, and they're clearly, I'm sure, taking advantage of it.
I don't see ways that they have found ways around it. I think that they've tightened up their screening criterias. I think that they have raised maybe what their move-in costs are. Like, again, another part of Measure 1 that passed is they put a cap on deposits or move-in costs up to 1 month's rent.
Okay.
Why that's not a good policy, or why that policy underserves, is because if I have a resident come to me and let's say they had an eviction in the last 3 years, and I would approve them if they paid an additional deposit.
Right.
I can't give them that option. I now would deny them. So it's not making it easier for residents to get into housing, particularly those who have something in their past in which the landlord wants to offset the risk. Or maybe, you don't have, maybe the landlord's policy is you have to have a certain number of years of rental history. Or what if you're just on the cusp of that 2.5 to 3 times, depending on the number? I mean, the deposit's really the only way that the landlord can kind of offset a risk. You're never made whole. But, I think that it goes back to there has to be a carrot and a stick. And, having the deposit, and deposits are refundable. So if you leave the home, you pay the rent, you pay the utilities, and you leave the home in the condition in which you rented it, then there's an incentive there because you're going to get your deposit back. And we've made a lot of changes in deposit at the state level. We passed a bill last year that made some changes to the deposit that landlords are collecting. But when we put caps, that's just one of those kind of, it doesn't take into consideration the benefit of why a landlord may ask for a little bit more. But back to your question, I think that that ironically, the low-income housing providers, and that includes nonprofits, primarily nonprofits, they are feeling the financial strain of these policies. When you talk to them, you talk to housing authorities, you talk about the other organizations in communities that are providing low-income housing. And this is housing where maybe the resident is using 50%, they're at 50% or 30% of the median area income. Those housing providers, their delinquencies are so high, and they're struggling to meet their operating cost. And look, we're all shopping at the same store to buy the same supplies. Nobody's getting a discount on labor, on plumbers, electricians, tradespeople, building supplies. None of us are getting discounts on those. So no matter where you're at on the economic spectrum of the housing that you provide, those costs are, of course, more significant for the low-income housing provider because the margins are a lot tighter, and particularly for those that maybe aren't receiving rent at all, but you're still having to go in and make those necessary repairs during the tenancy. I think that ultimately what happens is you just have housing providers who just leave the market. They divest here and they go somewhere else. Yeah. I think I'll go back to kind of a rent control problem is when the first rent control bill was introduced, the market didn't respond. The bill died, didn't go anywhere. It was probably 2022, that session with that rent control bill, that then we started to hear that lenders were paying attention and they were underwriting based on Washington State passing a rent control. So that made lending more difficult, made it more expensive and less accessible.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But it's going to keep coming up until it passes.
It's going to keep coming up for sure. Generally we say that these kind of bills can take up to 7 years before we see some version of it pass. I mean, I have good hopes that with the current supply that is coming into the marketplace, we're seeing rents level off. I think that what we saw was a consequence of COVID and the moratoriums during COVID was we went almost 3 rent cycles. We went 2 years, but almost 3 rent increase cycles of increasing rent. So when we came out of COVID, out of the moratorium, and when we lifted that, you saw higher than usual rent increases to do some catch up.
To offset.
Mind you, though, during this time of the eviction moratorium for 2 years, the counties were increasing at the highest rate that they could. I mean, the limit that a county can increase our property tax is 1%, but they were hitting the maximum that they could. And just another thing, what do counties do when or cities do when they can't when they can't meet their budget? They create a new tax or they increase our tax. I mean, this is how and so it's ironic that then when we as housing providers say the way that we cover our operating costs is we increase rent to offset all of these costs, which we don't create. We don't create the tax rate. Right. We don't create the cost of labor. We don't create the cost of materials, cost of insurance. I mean, our mortgage and interest rate are set. So
unless it's a commercial building.
sure, and then
Yeah.
it resets, and on that, those rates are based on performance, and commercial loans have they have metrics, and then they have expectations of performance, and rent control is not going to help that. Rent increase notices that are 6 months out skew that. I mean, it really changes the business model, if you will, or the how you have to work within a business model when everything changes. And remember, when you took your mortgage out, you didn't take it out only expecting that you could, only raise rent up to, in Tacoma, less than 5%.
Yeah.
So now you've got that becomes a competing issue, and I think that there are many landlords who just are frustrated, and they feel like it's complicated, and they feel like they can't keep up with all the changes, and they just assume leave the market. Homelessness.
Let's do
gosh.
that. Homelessness.
Here's a good example of, we keep, the state keeps spending more money on it, and the numbers continue to go up. So I would say it was back in 19 and 20. Let me think through. Then 18, 19, 21, 22, 23. Yeah. So let's say 19 and 20. The kind of the down in Olympia when we were in session, what we heard for those years from the advocates was evictions were the leading cause of homelessness.
Okay.
So we're like, how? Why? No. I mean, no way. Well, then we go into a moratorium where we couldn't evict anybody, and literally the homeless, rate increased. The number of people experiencing homelessness increased, doubled during a time which we were not evicting
Allowed
anybody.
to evict, yeah.
So it's like, okay, so I'm still waiting for an apology or an explanation. Like, so what's the explanation now that the numbers are double? Look, homelessness is not an affordability issue. If the rent was $50, could the person who is currently experiencing homelessness, who is unhoused, afford to pay $50? They couldn't. I think that, so it keeps being attacked, and I think that the issue of homelessness has been used by tenant advocates against landlords. Just simply saying that evictions cause. Well, if evictions cause homelessness, if that was a true statement, then why wasn't anybody investing in preventing evictions? And I think that's where it's frustrating that there's not efforts being made. There's not enough being done to prevent evictions, if you believe that. Now, I don't believe that. I think that there's, I think that first there's an addiction issue attached to it. I think also there's a mental health issue attached to it. And I think that for the person experiencing homelessness, those two issues have to be addressed for them to be successful and to be able to be in housing and sustain that housing. But I think that we need to find out what led that person into that place. It wasn't that the rent was increased.
No, I think you and I talked about it for a little bit with the whole problem with the homelessness. And again, it might be my immature way of talking or naiveness in me that wants to fix it somehow. But I don't believe throwing money at the problem is going to fix the problem, and saying, here's a house, go live in it, and figure out how to survive in a society when they have the mental issues, when they have the drug addiction problems. I believe we got to move them out and away from the city, away from the access to those drugs, provide nurses, provide doctors, provide counseling. We have to teach them how to survive in society. Like, this is how you dress, this is how you eat, like basic skills all over again, and help them get those jobs so they can get back up on their feet and learn.
Yeah, one thing
those basic skills.
Yeah, one thing that we saw during COVID and during the moratorium was the federal government flooded, the cities with, and we're no exception, and states, and then state handed down the money, but with a lot of rental assistance. I mean, at one point in Pierce County, they were spending $1 million a week in rental assistance, and they weren't serving everybody. So I think that what we should recognize of that is that when you're just handing out the money, but there's no expectation attached to it, there's nothing in which the resident has to do to become self-sufficient. There's nothing that there's no responsibility on their side to kind of identify, why am I unable to pay rent? Now, there was a period of time where we knew why people were unable to pay rent.
Yes.
Everything was shut down. But then we transitioned to a place where everybody was going back to work, and why were you continuing? And why were people $20,000 and $30,000 behind in rent? So I think that just like with somebody who's experiencing homelessness, if people want to meet them where they're at, but you've got to figure out, like, what do they need in order to be able to, to be successful in housing. Because just like I said, giving them a house and saying, okay, now that doesn't solve their other problems. So I think that we're spending enough money, probably more than we need to be spending. We're just not spending it in the right place.
Awesome. This was great. I'm so happy that you got to come here and break everything down for us. You are running for
state representative for the 26th district, which is Gig Harbor, Port Orchard, and West Bremerton.
So anybody that investing in Pierce and Kitsap County definitely needs to.
Absolutely. Yeah. In that district, there are 2 districts in our state that are considered swing districts, the 10th district and the 26th district. And what that means is that in both of those districts, you have that district has elected Republicans and Democrats to serve at the same time. So in the 26th, where I'm from, the 2 House seats are held by Republicans, and the Senate seat for the district is held by a Democrat. And right now in the legislature, both the House and the Senate are 1 seat away from having supermajority. So if the Democrats pick up 1 more seat in one of these swing districts or 1 more Senate seat, that will create a supermajority in both the House and the Senate. And look, if you're a housing provider, if you believe in balance, I think that reasonable people believe that one party shouldn't have that much control.
Of course.
When we have balance, that creates good dialogue. And if you're a housing provider and you care about rent control or B&O tax, investing in a local race and candidates that you support and that support your business, that's the best investment that you can make for your business. So yeah, it's a tough race, which really just shows how passionate people are about wanting to make change and come into Olympia and really try to fix it. I've been fortunate as a lobbyist sitting across from a lot of these lawmakers, working with them to find compromise and to find policies that can work on both sides. What I hope to bring back when I'm elected, and I will bring this back for certain, is the stakeholdering process where we sit down and we talk through issues and we learn each other's perspective so that we can better understand the problem, but then also a solution that works for everybody. Look, I don't work in the world of nonprofit. I'm not working with people that are unhoused. So as I say to people, like, I've never experienced food insecurity. So if we're going to talk about food insecurity, you have to talk to me like a 6th grader, because I don't understand it. But I'm really good at coming up with solutions, and I'm really good at understanding, how we can come to a better solution that's sustainable. I think a lot of the solutions that we come up with around spending, particularly around housing issues, they're not sustainable. They're document recording fees. Well, great when we're at the highest sales records of transactions in our state, but when that number dips down, so does the funding. So the problem is, so then you still have the same volume of the problem. You still have the same number of people to serve, but you have less dollars because it's tied to something that goes up and down with the market.
Excellent. I hope people will go out and vote for you to see some changes in the industry, and hopefully you can make some of those changes.
Absolutely.
When elected. Thank you so much for coming out here. Definitely got to do this again.
I know we can go on for
updates
I know
for hours. Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you.